Okay, so I am your next speaker. If you missed my talk earlier this morning, my name is Leslie Cooper. I'm the Arkansas Monarch and Pollinator Coordinator, and part of my job is to coordinate for the Arkansas Monarch Conservation Partnership. Today I'm going to give an overview of monarch biology and conservation in the natural state. There will be quite a bit of overlap from the previous presentation, but I'm hoping that we'll be able to dig in just a little bit deeper, and we'll have plenty of times at the end for any questions that you have about monarchs. So the monarch butterfly is one of North America's most iconic insects. There are 3 distinct populations of monarchs in the US. There's a small non-migratory population in southern Florida, a western population that's found west of the Rockies. This population overwinters along the coast in California. And the largest migratory population is east of the Rockies, and these are the butterflies that we see here in Arkansas. Arkansas is in the migratory pathway of the monarch in the spring and fall. We're also in the spring breeding grounds. So that means that we see quite a few monarchs in the spring, and then there's a little bit of a lull in the summer. I did see some in July this year, but not nearly as frequently as the spring and fall. So the eastern population overwinters in central Mexico. Recent studies in Arizona have actually found that monarchs in the southeast, like in Arizona, can migrate to overwinter in either California or Mexico. And that's pretty new tagging information, and it's very exciting that we're still learning about monarchs, even now. So their migration is one of the largest animal migrations in the world. It stretches over 3,000 miles from the southern parts of Canada to their overwintering grounds in central Mexico. And you'd think that because this is such a large migration that spans, 3 different countries, you'd think that we would have always known where these monarchs overwintered, but the overwintering grounds really weren't discovered until the several decades ago. It was a lot more recently than you'd think. So over the past 2 decades, however, monarch butterfly populations have declined significantly due to a variety of factors, including habitat loss and a lack of milkweed plants. Milkweed is the sole host plant used by the monarch during its egg and larval stages. So this population graph is produced annually by Monarch Watch, and it shows the general decline of the monarch population that overwinters in Mexico over time. This graph shows the total area covered by the overwintering monarchs in hectares in the month of December. So a hectare is about 2.5 acres, which is about 2.5 football fields, including the end zones. So following an overwintering population that covered less than 1 hectare in 2014, a presidential memorandum was issued from the White House directing federal actions to address the issue of pollinator conservation, resulting in the creation of a pollinator health task force. In the same year, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was petitioned to list the monarch as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. A listing determination will be announced December 15th of this year. At the highest peak on this graph, experts estimated that 18 hectares was the equivalent of 1 billion monarch butterflies that covered the area. And although there has been an increase in recent years, I'd like to highlight that the 10-year average is still only 2.8 hectares. And experts have determined that we need to sustain an average overwintering population of 6.6 hectares to maintain the monarch migration. So as I mentioned, this graph shows the overwintering populations for the monarchs east of the Rockies. The western population, however, has declined over 99% since the 1980s and are at risk of quasi-extinction. Well, and this just means that the population could collapse, and it could lead to extinction of that population and possibly end the western monarch migration. So monarchs undergo complete metamorphosis which means that they pass through a distinct egg, larval, pupal, and adult stage. The monarch life cycle begins with a female laying a single egg on the underside of a leaf of a milkweed plant. If you're looking at milkweed and you see more than one egg, more than likely you've had more than one visitor. However, there's always an exception to the rule. And this female monarch that I took a picture of in my backyard actually laid multiple eggs on each milkweed stem. So after being laid, it takes 3 to 5 days for the egg to hatch, and shortly before hatching, the tip of the egg turns black. This is the head capsule of the caterpillar pigmenting. And after hatching, the first instar caterpillar usually eats its eggshell. And you can see how small that caterpillar starts out at. Monarch caterpillars have 5 instars. An instar is the phase between molting. So after eating leaf material, the first instar caterpillar will molt and become a second instar so that it can grow larger. Monarch caterpillar skin doesn't stretch, so they have to molt so that they can grow larger. In the photo on the right, there's a freshly molted second instar caterpillar. After molting, the caterpillar usually turns around and eats the discarded skin. The larval stage for monarchs typically lasts 2 weeks, and during this time, they consume a lot of milkweed. So the equivalent would be a human baby growing to the size of an elephant in 2 weeks. So when a monarch larva is ready to form a chrysalis, it crawls away from the milkweed plant, and it finds a sheltered area. It then spins a silk button with the spinneret located beneath its mandibles or jaws. And once the button is spun, it turns back around and hangs upside down from its abdomen for about 12 to 18 hours. When the monarch is ready, the larvae molts one last time, with the skin splitting at the back of the head and neck area. And actually, although it's hung there for quite some time, once the process starts, it only takes about 30 seconds for molt to finish. So the shiny green and yellow pupa below in that fourth picture is still soft, but within 30 minutes, the pupa will reshape itself into what most people recognize as the monarch pupa or chrysalis, and that's the photo on the right. It kind of scrunches up. And the casing will completely harden within the next 24 hours. So the monarch uses something called a cremaster to hang from the silk pad that it spins. And this stem-like appendage is kind of like a Q-tip with Velcro on the end. And you can see the microscopic image of the tiny hooks that allows the monarch to hang upside down. So monarchs remain in the chrysalis phase for about 10 to 14 days after pupation, depending on environmental conditions. So if conditions are right, the process goes a lot faster. If it's a little bit colder and the conditions aren't quite right, then it takes a little bit longer. So after about 2 weeks, the pigmentation of the adult butterfly begins to show through the transparent casing of the pupa. Pigment is the last thing to form before a monarch is ready to eclose or emerge from the pupa casing. It's actually a myth that butterflies and moths turn into soup inside the pupa. If you look carefully, even a newly formed chrysalis will show wing veins beneath the surface. So it takes about 30 to 60 seconds for a monarch to open the casing and make its way out. I don't know if you can see it, but in the last photo on the bottom, you can kind of see how its abdomen is enlarged. And at first, after eclosing, the wings look very small and deformed, but the monarch uses fluid in its abdomen and actually pumps it into the wings to make them expand to their full size. And the adult will hang upside down for 3 to 5 hours after it emerges to let its wings dry and harden. into their shape. And the adult is still very fragile for the first 24 to 48 hours after it closes, but they can fly as soon as their wings harden. So the process from egg to adult can take as little as 28 days, again, if conditions are right. So this process is pretty quick. So monarchs have 4 to 5 generations a year. Monarch wings are covered in individually pigmented scales, which gives them their distinctive colors. If you've ever, heard about dust on butterfly wings that helps them fly, it's not entirely wrong, but it's not really a dust. There are these tiny scales that cover the wings, and if you rub the dust off, then they can't fly. Well, most of the time, tiny hands that like to handle butterflies will scrape the scales off and damage the wings to the point where the insect will die. So monarchs are sexually dimorphic, which means that males and females of the species look different. And it's easiest to tell them apart as adults, and I'll give you a second to take a guess on which is which. Okay, if you've got the guess in your head, so the female monarch is on the left, while the male is on the right. And males have scent spots on their hind wings to help with the mating process. And they also have thinner veins on their wings. Females have thicker veins and maybe slightly duller. These photos aren't the best examples because the female butterfly, you can tell is older than the male. She's a little bit more beat up, and she's missing pieces of her hind wings as well. So you can kind of see how she's a little bit beat up with those scales that have been scraped off. Oops. Hold on. I did want to mention on this slide that non-migratory adults live 2 to 6 weeks after they eclose from the pupa. And during this time, they will mate, and in the case of the female, lay eggs. Both sexes need nectar sources to survive, and they aren't, obligated to milkweed when they're adults, just the caterpillars are. And monarchs that overwinter can live up to 9 months. So, as Jennifer mentioned in the previous presentation, there are some species that mimic monarchs. One that we have here in Arkansas is the viceroy. So that is the monarch in the upper photo, and the photo on the bottom is of a viceroy. So viceroys have different flying patterns, and they also have different larval host plants than monarchs. They're slightly smaller, but the easiest way to tell them apart is this line that runs perpendicular on their hind wings. This line is visible on both sides of the wing that you can see here in this photo. So some other species that are commonly mistaken for the monarch are the queen butterfly that you can see on the left and the Gulf fritillary on the right. So we do see Gulf fritillaries in Arkansas, but we do not see queen butterflies. I actually took all the photos that I have of queens in Arizona last year. So the queen butterfly is closely related to the monarch and is the same genus, and it also uses milkweed as a larval host plant. They're a darker orange color, kind of a burnt orange, and they have more white spots on their wings. And so these are queen caterpillars. They have similar coloration to monarchs, but have a third set of tentacles on their bodies. And I took these photos last year also in Arizona. So you can notice that there's also some tinges of red where the tentacles meet the base of the body. And even though the coloration is quite different between the two photos, it is the same species. So monarchs actually experience these same color variations. And one research study shows that that the coloration could depend on the microclimate that they're in. So darker caterpillars are in colder areas so that they can absorb more heat, and lighter colored monarchs are they're in sunnier, warmer spots so that, they can regulate their body temperature more easily. So we discussed the monarch life cycle, and I've mentioned their migration, but this second graph really helps visualize the annual cycle of the breeding generations and the overwintering generation. So this graph is slightly outdated, as new research has shown that there's more commonly a fifth generation in the cycle that researchers really didn't know about, but I still think it does a really good job of showing the generational kind of leapfrog that accomplishes this incredible migration. So monarchs' overwintering grounds, at least the eastern population, are in Michoacan, Mexico, in the Oymel fir forest. In the center photo, you'll see a lot of orange on the trees, but this isn't foliage. It's hundreds of thousands of butterflies covering the branches and trunks of the trees in clusters. The branches literally sag under the weight of these butterflies. And if you haven't before, I highly recommend going on YouTube and searching for some videos of the overwintering grounds. It's truly a magnificent spectacle. So this is where the monarch colonies are measured in hectares. Scientists use an estimate of 10 to 50 million individuals per hectare, but new remote sensing technology is helping scientists get a better population estimate. So if you're familiar with LiDAR, they're actually using terrestrial LiDAR to map the trees and map the butterflies and be able to get more accurate counts that way. It's really fascinating. So from November through March, monarchs that have migrated throughout the breeding range spend the winter in the Oymel fir forest of central Mexico that we just saw. And something I forgot to mention is in these high elevation fir forests, there's actually a microclimate that the monarchs need to survive the winter. And it's kind of comparable to like a refrigerator, and that helps them live so long. But in the early spring, these monarchs begin their journey north, and reaching the southern areas of the U.S. where that middle bubble is where they lay the eggs on the available milkweed. So I've had the privilege of listening to a couple lectures done by Dr. Chip Taylor, who is the founder of Monarch Watch, which is the organization that puts out that graph that I showed earlier. And he is able, he's watched this migration and the population trends for so long now. He's able to estimate the next year's overwintering population based on climate data and how fast the monarchs move north, depending on the weather, because that's kind of what they're waiting on is the weather. So the longer that they stay in Texas and the more monarchs that are able to be produced in the spring breeding area, the more successful the next overwintering population will be. So the offspring of the overwintering generation, so this first generation that comes from the southeast in March and April, continues on, and 3 to 4 additional breeding generations, as we discussed, are seen during the season in the northern parts of the range. And this time range on the map really just represents the time that the migration front moves through the region. So even though they're showing that most of the monarchs are up there, by about July, they've made it into the southern parts of Canada. And it's not as common to see monarchs in Arkansas at that time, but it's not impossible either. So starting in mid-August, monarchs from the northern breeding range begin the southward migration back to Mexico. And, they reach these overwintering sites in early November. So again, this graph shows generation 4, and more research is coming out that generation 5 and maybe even 6 are possible and very important for those overwintering populations. One thing that I will mention is that this fourth or fifth generation, the overwintering generation, they live up to 9 months. And this is possible because they're born into a state of reproductive diapause. And diapause is just the time period where they're reproductively dormant. So their bodies really aren't producing those pheromones so that they can mate and lay eggs and give birth to the next generation. Everything's kind of put on hold, and they go to overwinter. Their entire focus is building up fat reserves for overwintering in Mexico for 9 months. So in the spring, they break that diapause and start the process over again. So if you have been with us all morning, Sarah Wittenberg showed a very pretty version of this graph, but it's the same study. And this figure shows the estimated percentage of where overwintering monarchs come from. Although 38% are produced from across the Midwest, all of the area shaded in green is important for monarch conservation. And this paper was published in 2017, and it really was just sourcing the natal origin where these butterflies were born that were overwintering in Mexico. So as I mentioned before, monarch caterpillars are host plant specialists. They feed only on milkweed. There are more than 100 species of milkweeds in the U.S., native milkweeds in the U.S., and there are 21 species of native milkweed in Arkansas. And it's a common misconception that monarch caterpillars only eat plants in the Asclepias genera, but several genera of milkweeds that we have in Arkansas are milk vines, and they have also been known to be used by monarchs. So here are pictures of monarchs on 4 different species that are native to Arkansas. From left to right, there's tall green milkweed, which is Asclepias hortella. There's swamp milkweed with the pink flowers, which is Asclepias incarnata. The second to last one is world milkweed, which is Asclepias verticillata. And then the last one is green antelope horn milkweed, also known as spider milkweed, also known as green milkweed, which is Asclepias viridis. So milkweeds are known for their milky sap that they get their name from. They also contain toxins called cardiac glycosides. When monarch caterpillars eat these cardenolides, their bodies keep the toxins and make them unpalatable to predators. So Dr. Lincoln Brower conducted a study in the 1960s with blue jays, and he fed these birds different butterflies, but after consuming the monarchs that had fed on milkweed, the blue jays vomited and wouldn't eat another orange butterfly. So the birds didn't die, but it did make them sick. And, these warning colors did what they were supposed to do, and they did not want to mess with those orange butterflies. So adults also need nectar plants. So high quality monarch habitat has a high diversity of native nectar sources in addition to milkweeds for the caterpillars. The overwintering generation of monarchs, again, are born into that state of reproductive diapause, and they need to focus on, migrating to the overwintering grounds in Mexico. So tropical milkweed, or Asclepias purussavica, is not native to Arkansas or the United States. Tropical milkweed can increase infection rates with Ophriocistis electroscura, or OE, which is a protozoan parasite that reduces monarch survival rates. Tropical milkweed can be present later in the year when native milkweed species have died back. And research has shown that the presence of milkweed can cause adult monarchs to break that diapause and begin laying eggs. So the disruption to the migration that this causes increases the likelihood that those late season caterpillars will not make it to adulthood. Tropical milkweed also goes by a few other names. We've seen it marketed as bloodflower, Mexican milkweed, Mexican butterfly weed, and in recent years, since people are learning that it's not necessarily recommended to grow tropical milkweed. Different nurseries are selling it as butterfly weed, which, if you're not looking at the scientific name, is very close to butterfly milkweed, which is Asclepias tuberosa. They also kind of look similar. In the upper right-hand corner, you can see the bright orange butterfly milkweed, which is Asclepias tuberosa, and then on the left is tropical milkweed, which has these distinctive yellow and red flowers. So there's also a bright yellow morph, like cultivar, of the tropical milkweed, and I'm not sure what that cultivar is called, but the one on the right is native to Arkansas. And if you want to learn more, the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation has some material on this topic. So as I talked about earlier, the eastern monarch population is still in trouble. So what's happening? Why is the population, steadily declining? Mainly, the overuse of herbicides and insecticides like neonicotinoids, and there's still illegal logging that's occurring in the overwintering grounds. So what is Arkansas doing? Well, we have formed the Arkansas Monarch Conservation Partnership. It's a collaborative of different agencies. The steering committee put forth the Arkansas Monarch and Pollinator Conservation Plan in May of 2018. If you missed my talk this morning, there's going to be a video recording of it later. And the best way that you can help monarchs and pollinators in Arkansas is you can create habitat by planting native species, participate in citizen science initiatives like our two previous speakers mentioned, and you can support the efforts of local conservation agencies and organizations. The Arkansas Monarch Mapping Project is on iNaturalist, and I'm out of time, but if there's any quick questions, I'd love to answer them.
Leslie, Jane had a question. She was asking what plant nurseries in Arkansas are doing a good job of promoting appropriate plants.
So let's see, Pine Ridge Gardens is one of the more well-established native plant nurseries. There's several in Arkansas that only sell at pop-up native plant sales. So if you follow Audubon Arkansas or our Facebook page or the Arkansas Native Plant Society, they have a great list of resources for native plant nurseries and seed sources. And also, I would like to say that, buying plugs or container plants that are already started is really helpful. If you're new and getting started, but I have no experience with native gardening, and this last year I successfully propagated 5 different species of milkweed from seed. So if you can't afford to buy all of those plants, I do encourage you to start them yourself.
Okay, Jessica asked quickly, do the chrysalises ever overwinter? I have 2 that never hatched. So unfortunately, the monarch chrysalises are not a species that overwinters. There's several moth species and other native butterflies that do, fall in the soil and overwinter in kind of leaf material. Unfortunately, if you have a chrysalis that didn't, ever pigment correctly, sometimes they'll turn kind of a blackish brown color, and you can't tell that it's a monarch inside. It means that the chrysalis has died. So thank you everyone for tuning in.